Hi friends, welcome to Sleepy Story. This is your quiet place where worries slow down and thoughts become soft and gentle. Good evening and welcome to Sleepy Stories. Imagine yourself as a commanding officer in the Napoleonic Wars. The battle has not yet been fought. There is no enemy in sight. Instead, you are looking at columns of men, horses, and wagons stretching down a muddy road. Before you think about maneuver or victory, you have to ask quieter questions. How many days of bread remain? How far can the horses pull before they begin to die? What happens when the land ahead cannot give you what your army needs? Tonight's story is not about a single battle or a single brilliant decision made over a map. It is about the daily mechanism that made armies move at all. Bread, fodder, wagons, contracts, depots, paperwork, and the limits of taking what you need from the ground you are marching over. In the Napoleonic Wars, victory and defeat were shaped again and again by whether an army could be fed, shod, supplied with cartridges, kept in horses, and kept coherent over distance. Strategy did not disappear, but it lived inside logistical boundaries that could only be stretched so far. Now let's get right into it. At the end of the 18th century, European armies already depended on an older language of supply. Magazines, convoys, and administrative officers tasked with feeding soldiers from stocks gathered in advance. This was the conventional answer to the problem that armies consume enormous quantities every day and cannot, in most places, simply buy what they need at market prices without instantly exhausting local supply. A magazine system tried to solve this by moving the burden backward in time. Grain would be collected months earlier, milled into flour, baked into bread at fixed points, and then forwarded along routes of march. Forage would be accumulated for horses, and salt meat or live cattle would be positioned where an army could reach them. The system required money, storage, transport, and discipline, and it was vulnerable to any disruption. A river in flood, a convoy delayed by bad roads, a local population refusing to sell, a contractor defaulting, or a commander marching faster than the administrative tail could follow. The French Revolution changed not just the size of armies, but the political conditions under which they were supplied. France's wars after 1792 were fought with mass conscription and with financial instability. The state struggled with revenue, currency problems, and the administrative upheavals of revolution. In that context, French armies did not invent the idea of living off the land, but they used it more aggressively and more systematically than many opponents expected, especially in campaigns beyond France's borders. The concept sounded simple. Instead of dragging enormous stocks behind you, take what you need from the country you occupy. In practice, it demanded organization. Requisition was not the same as random plunder, at least in theory. It relied on orders, receipts, local officials coerced into cooperation, and units detached to collect grain, cattle, and fodder. It also relied on the idea that war could pay for war, through forced contributions levied on enemy states and occupied territories, and through the seizure of state stores and taxable wealth. From the beginning, this approach carried a built-in contradiction. The faster and farther an army moved, the more it leaned on local supply. But the more it leaned on local supply, the more it depended on the density of resources near its route, the season of the year, the goodwill or fear of the inhabitants, and the ability of its officers to prevent foraging from dissolving into chaos. It also depended on time. Even if a region had food, it was not automatically in a form the army could use. Grain still needed milling, flour still needed baking, cattle needed driving, slaughtering, and distribution. Fodder had to be cut, bundled, and brought to the horses. A living landscape did not equal an edible ration without an intermediate layer of labor and control. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise coincided with the development of the French corps system, which became a central frame within which supply was managed. A corps could march on separate roads, concentrate quickly, and fight independently for a time. This flexibility was strategic, but it was also logistical. Several corps marching along parallel routes could draw food from a wider strip of country than a single-massed army on one road. The same system reduced immediate pressure on any one town's stocks and spread the burden of requisition. Yet it also multiplied administrative work. Each corps needed its own arrangements for bread, meat, and forage. Each had to maintain records and issue orders, and each had to coordinate with the army's overall line of communication back to depots and borders. Behind the marching columns stood an administrative world that rarely appears in popular accounts. The French army maintained officers and officials responsible for supply and accounting, often grouped under what can broadly be described as the commissariat and the administrative services of war. They handled requisitions, payments, contracts, the organization of bread baking, the management of depots, and the distribution of rations. Their work intersected with the Army's staff system. Orders moved downward from headquarters through staff channels. Requests and reports moved upward. How much flour was on hand? How many days of bread remained? How many oxen had been procured? How many horses were unfit? How many wagons had broken down? Whether mills were functioning, whether a bridge could take loaded carts, whether a route was passable after rain. If those reports were false or delayed, commanders could march into emptiness. The basic daily problem was arithmetic. An infantryman's staple ration in European armies was bread, often supplemented by meat when available, and sometimes by rice, vegetables, or other local food. Exact ration scales varied and were not always met, but the centrality of bread did not. Bread required flour, and flour required mills. An army that moved into a region without functioning mills, or that arrived before grinding and baking could be organized, could not simply eat the countryside without paying in hunger and disorder. This is why magazines, even in armies that relied heavily on requisition, did not disappear. They changed their role. Instead of being the sole foundation of supply, magazines became buffers and accelerators. They were meant to smooth the transition between regions, to cover days when requisitions failed, and to concentrate supplies at points where the army would turn, fight, or pause. A magazine was not just a pile of sacks. It was a building system. Granaries, warehouses, guarded yards, sometimes converted monasteries or civic buildings, sometimes purpose-built storage, sometimes improvised spaces under military control. It required guards and clerks. It required scales, inventories, and methods to prevent theft. It required transport onward, carts or pack animals, and, when possible, water transport on rivers and canals. It also required security. A warehouse full of flour was useless if raiders burned it, partisans stole it, or an enemy cavalry raid cut the road and scattered the escort. Transport was the next constraint. French armies at the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars often depended on a mixture of military wagons and requisitioned or hired civilian vehicles. Civilian carts could be obtained in large numbers, but they were fragile instruments of war. Owners resisted, drivers deserted, horses or oxen were hidden, harness was inadequate, wheels broke on bad roads. Civilian carts were designed for local hauling, not for weeks of continuous movement with heavy loads through mud, ruts, and river crossings. The army attempted to impose order through requisition schedules, escorts, and penalties, but in hostile or exhausted regions the system steadily degraded. Over time, The French state sought to formalize and militarize transport. Specialized military train units were created and expanded to provide more reliable wagon services, particularly for artillery and later for the broader army baggage and supply transport. This shift mattered because Napoleon's campaigns increasingly depended on rapid operational movement, and rapid movement required some predictability in where ammunition, tools, and basic food supplies could be expected to appear. Yet even with military train units, the fundamental dependence on horses and roads remained. Horses required vast amounts of forage. In a period when there were no motor vehicles and no railways, the army's transport energy was biological. The more wagons you brought, the more horses you needed. The more horses you needed, the more forage you had to secure. The more forage you had to secure, the more wagons and detachments were required to carry or collect it. This circular pressure could turn a transport solution into a transport problem. The same logic applied to cavalry remounts, artillery horses, and draft animals. Horses were vulnerable to exhaustion, disease, and starvation. In wet climates, hoof problems and harness sores could cripple teams. In winter, forage was scarce and water sources froze. In areas where fodder had been stripped by earlier armies, horse strength collapsed quickly. An army could replace lost men through conscription and drafts, but it could not quickly replace trained horses and the harness, wagons, and skilled drivers that made them useful. When horses died, wagons stopped. When wagons stopped, flour and ammunition piled up in depots or were abandoned. When rations failed, straggling increased. And as straggling increased, the army's tactical strength shrank even if its paper strength looked unchanged. Napoleon's administrative method sought to harness both requisition and centralized preparation. Before major campaigns, the French state and army attempted to create a chain of depots and magazines behind the intended theater of operations. These depots were often placed along major rivers or in fortified cities, where supplies could be stored with some security and moved forward in stages. The system of stages, etapes, was meant to structure movement and supply. Along main routes, the army established designated stopping points where bread might be issued, where cattle might be assembled, where sick could be collected, where shoes and clothing could be distributed if available, and where administrative officers could coordinate with local authorities. In theory, this turned a road into an artery. In practice, the artery clotted when too many troops passed too quickly, when roads dissolved in rain, when animals died, or when the local base had been stripped bare. Contracts were another pillar, and they reveal how Napoleonic warfare was not only military but commercial and bureaucratic. Armies needed predictable flows of flour, bread, meat, spirits, salt, cloth, leather, shoes, gunpowder ingredients, and other materials. The state did not always produce these internally. It relied on private contractors for parts of the supply chain, particularly for baking, meat supply, and sometimes transport and equipment. Contractors could mobilize commercial networks and warehouses faster than a newly reorganized state bureaucracy. They could also fail, cheat, or demand terms that the state could not easily meet. Payment could be made in money when the treasury was functioning, but it could also be made through assignments on local revenues, through forced contributions, or through the expectation that contractors would recoup costs in occupied territories. That blurred the line between public finance and private profit, and it created incentives for corruption, underdelivery, and the substitution of inferior goods. The frontier between requisition and contract was often unstable. When the army moved into enemy territory, requisition orders could compel towns and districts to deliver specified quantities. So many quintals of flour, so many head of cattle, so many loads of hay, so many pairs of shoes, so many carts. Local officials might be ordered to assemble these goods at a given time and place, under threat of fines, imprisonment, or worse. Receipts could be issued promising eventual payment, but the value of those receipts depended on whether the French administration remained in control and whether the post-war settlement recognized the obligations. In some regions, this system functioned because local elites decided compliance was the least damaging option. In others, it fueled resistance. Where resistance grew, supply collection required escorts and punitive measures, which consumed manpower and further damaged local production. Information flow mattered in a very literal way. Headquarters needed to know what a region could provide, what was already taken, what roads were passable, and what stores existed in enemy magazines. Napoleon valued speed, but speed required knowledge. Reconnaissance was not only about enemy troops, it was about mills, bridges, rivers, and depots. Staff officers and administrative officials produced reports and tables. If the estimates were wrong, the army could outrun its food. If local guides misled them, columns could march into areas without supply. If maps were inadequate, the army could be forced onto a single road, increasing congestion and making requisition harder. This is why some of Napoleon's early campaigns worked as logistical demonstrations, even when they are remembered for tactics. In Italy in 1796-1797, French forces operated in a relatively rich and densely settled region compared with some later theaters. They also fought against states that had magazines and treasuries that could be seized. The ability to impose contributions on defeated territories and to requisition food from towns helped compensate for France's fiscal weakness. Yet even there, the system depended on tight control and on the ability to keep the army moving through areas not yet stripped. When movement stalled, the burden on the local base intensified, and the moral economy of requisition quickly became unstable, with plunder and disorder threatening the cohesion of units. By the time Napoleon became first consul and then emperor, the French state improved in fiscal and administrative capacity compared with the most chaotic revolutionary years. But the scale of warfare grew as well. Campaigns involved multiple armies, long frontiers, and complex coalition warfare. Napoleon's operational style often sought a decisive campaign that would end quickly, reducing the time the army had to sustain itself in hostile country. A short campaign was a logistical asset. It reduced wear on shoes and horses, reduced the time for disease to spread, and reduced the cumulative damage to the line of communication. Many of his most successful campaigns were short, but the very success of that method encouraged larger strategic ambitions and longer lines, and those created the conditions for logistical strain. Consider how the magazine concept interacted with the corps system during the 1805 campaign in Central Europe. French forces moved rapidly from camps near the Channel coast toward the Rhine, and then into the Danube basin. Such a movement demanded coordination of routes, bridging, and staged supply. The Rhine was a logistical highway, and so were other navigable rivers when controlled. Water transport could move heavy loads more efficiently than wagons over bad roads. Whenever French planning could anchor itself on rivers and fortified cities, the supply system had a better chance of keeping pace. But even in 1805, rapid movement meant that units frequently relied on local requisition, particularly for immediate subsistence and forage. The decisive envelopment of an opposing army could also yield a decisive logistical prize. Captured magazines, captured artillery parks, captured horses, and the sudden availability of stored food and ammunition. Capturing enemy magazines was not a minor bonus. It could reset an entire campaign's supply equation. A major fortress or city often contained stores intended for an enemy army. Flour, salt, biscuits, oats, hay, sometimes clothing and shoes, and the administrative infrastructure to distribute them. When those stores fell intact, the victors could feed themselves while the defeated lost not only current supplies but the future supplies planned for their next move. This is one reason sieges and fortress lines mattered even in an era of rapid field operations. They were not only tactical obstacles, they were storage nodes. The flip side was that an enemy who refused battle and retreated could also deny supplies by stripping magazines, removing milling equipment, driving off cattle, or destroying bridges and boats. Scorched earth measures were not unique to Russia in 1812, but in Russia they were applied at a scale and depth that interacted with distance to produce catastrophic results. The farther the French army advanced from its base, the more it depended on an intermediate system of depots and stages, and the more those depots depended on transport animals that were themselves consuming the forage that became harder to find. In Central Europe and parts of Germany, Napoleon could often find dense networks of towns, roads, and agricultural production. Even there, when multiple corps marched through the same region within days, the effect resembled a swarm. One corps could requisition what was available, and the next would find emptiness. Administrative officers could attempt to allocate zones and schedules, but the pace of operations and the fog of war made perfect allocation impossible. This led to a constant tension between operational independence and centralized control. Napoleon wanted corps commanders to move fast and seize opportunities, but he also needed them not to strip the same district twice, and not to pull wagons and cattle away from the planned supply route. In Prussia and Poland in 1806-1807, the problem of season and infrastructure became harder. Winter campaigning stressed transport and health. Roads became mud or ice. Horses weakened. Bread supply became more dependent on prepositioned stocks and on the ability to keep bakeries functioning. Armies could still requisition, but collecting food in winter meant fewer available crops in the fields, more dependence on stored grain, and more resistance from local populations who feared starvation. When armies clashed repeatedly without a quick settlement, the operational logic of live off the land turned into the administrative reality of stripping land that could no longer recover during the campaign. The result was not merely hunger, it was a loss of marching efficiency. Units straggled to search for food, discipline frayed, and the time spent foraging reduced the time available for coordinated maneuvers. Spain, beginning in 1808, revealed another structural limit. Spain contained fertile regions, but it also contained mountains, poor roads in many areas, and an increasingly hostile population. A supply system based on requisition assumes a degree of coercive control over local administration. But if local officials fled, resisted, or were killed, the mechanism of requisition broke down. If guerrilla forces and insurgents attacked convoys and couriers, the line of communication became a battlefield. In that situation, the French army had to divert troops to escort supply, garrison towns, protect depots, and punish resistance. Every battalion tied to convoy duty was a battalion not available for decisive battle. Over time, a theater like Spain could absorb tens of thousands of troops in small posts and marching columns without delivering the kind of decisive political settlement Napoleon sought. Spain also highlights the difference between taking food and creating a reliable ration system. Even if foraging parties could seize cattle or grain, the distribution of that food to units required organization. Bread still needed bakeries, meat still needed slaughter, If supply became irregular, soldiers ate when they could, not when the army planned. That created uneven strength. Units near towns ate. Units on remote roads went hungry. Soldiers left ranks to forage. Detachments grew. Straggling became normal. That kind of erosion was cumulative. It did not always produce immediate battlefield defeat, but it reduced the army's ability to concentrate and to exploit tactical successes. This is also where contracts and finance reappear with sharp consequences. Long wars strained state finances. Late pay, lack of clothing, and shortages of equipment pushed soldiers toward unofficial requisition and plunder. Meanwhile, contractors operating in insecure environments demanded higher prices and stronger guarantees. If the state could not pay in stable currency, it paid in promises or in access to seized resources. That invited fraud because measuring delivery in wartime is difficult. Flour can be adulterated. Bread can be underweight. Oats can be mixed with chaff. Shoes can be made with inferior leather. Administrative inspections existed, but they competed with operational urgency and with corruption. When inspections were strict, supplies slowed. When inspections were lax, quality collapsed. For the Napoleonic army, ammunition and weapons supply ran parallel to food supply and often competed for the same transport. Infantry needed cartridges, and artillery needed shot, shell, and powder. Armies could sometimes capture enemy ammunition, but calibers and compatibility were not always straightforward, and captured ammunition could not be relied on. The artillery parks and ammunition trains were heavy. They demanded strong teams and good roads. If horses died from lack of forage, the gun teams weakened. If gun teams weakened, guns were abandoned. Retreats made this visible, but the process often began long before a retreat, in the slow thinning of horse strength and the growing gaps between fighting troops and their parks. Medical and veterinary realities added another layer. Disease killed and disabled far more soldiers than battle in many campaigns. Hospitals needed buildings, linens, medicines, and transport for the sick. The sick needed food as well. Evacuating wounded and sick consumed wagons that might otherwise carry flour or ammunition. If evacuation failed, soldiers died or were captured, and units lost cohesion. Horses suffered epidemics and exhaustion. Veterinary care existed but was limited. Replacement animals needed procurement, which meant more requisition or purchase, which in turn required money or coercion, and then required time to harness and integrate. All these systems came together most dramatically in the 1812 invasion of Russia, because the campaign stretched every variable to an extreme. Distance, army size, hostile terrain, deliberate denial of supplies, and the limits of transport animals. Before the invasion, French planning did include the creation of large depots and magazines in the rear, particularly in the regions that would support the advance. Cities and fortified points in the Polish and Prussian areas under French influence were used as staging points, and the intention was to feed the army forward through a chain of depots. There were also efforts to stockpile flour, oats, and other essentials, and to organize bakeries and transport. Yet the numbers involved were immense, and the dependence on horses was absolute. Even a well-stocked depot is useless if wagons cannot carry its contents forward, and wagons cannot move without horses, and horses cannot survive without local forage. As the army crossed into areas where roads were poor and settlements were more widely spaced, the friction increased. The army marched over large distances, and the heat of summer followed by the hardships of later months stressed men and animals. Foraging became harder where populations fled or concealed stores, and where Russian forces removed supplies. Even when supplies existed, The labor to collect and process them increased as distances between villages grew. Milling and baking became bottlenecks. Moving flour forward required wagons. Moving wagons forward required fodder. But stripping fodder from the countryside made it harder for later columns and for the return march. The line of communication became a long corridor vulnerable to attack and disruption. Couriers could be intercepted. Depots could be raided or burned. Bridges could be destroyed. In such circumstances, headquarters might still issue orders based on paper assumptions that did not match reality. A corps could be told that bread would be available at a given stage, and arrive to find that the convoy never came, or that the local district had already been emptied by earlier troops, or that the bakery lacked flour. Then the corps would send out foragers, dispersing its men and reducing its ability to respond to enemy movements. Dispersal also increased desertion and straggling, because men away from the ranks could slip away or become separated. When the army later retreated, the supply logic reversed and became even harsher. Regions already stripped could not suddenly provide anew. Depots that had been created on the way in might be empty, destroyed, or captured. The retreating army also carried less transport capacity because horses had died. This forced the abandonment of equipment and stores. Without equipment, soldiers could not cook efficiently. Without cooking, they could not convert raw grain into food. Without food, they weakened. As they weakened, marching speed fell. As speed fell, they became more vulnerable. The chain was mechanical and relentless. Yet it is important to keep the system-level view even here. The catastrophe was not simply the result of one choice to live off the land, or one failure to build depots. It was the collision of multiple interacting constraints, the mismatch between the planned supply chain and the speed and depth of the advance, the consumption of transport energy by horses requiring fodder, the vulnerability of long routes to disruption, the limited ability of local production and storage to feed a massive army moving through it, and the seasonal change that turned roads and temperatures into additional enemies. If any one of those constraints had been less severe, the outcome might have been less catastrophic, but the campaign pushed all of them at once. The later campaigns of 1813 and 1814 show logistics in another form, rebuilding an army after catastrophic loss. France could mobilize men again, but material and trained animals were harder to replace. The French army in Germany in 1813 faced opponents increasingly able to coordinate and to apply pressure on lines of communication. Coalition forces could threaten French depots and cut routes. Meanwhile, France's own territory became a supply base under strain. Conscription could fill ranks, but feeding and equipping new formations demanded shoes, muskets, cartridges, uniforms, and horses. Shortages meant many troops were less well equipped than earlier veterans. Administrative systems could assign rations on paper that could not be fulfilled in practice. This did not prevent armies from fighting, but it reduced endurance, the ability to march rapidly, and the ability to recover after losses. In 1814, fighting moved into France itself. This created a different supply environment. On one hand, operating on home territory could, in theory, simplify supply. Shorter distances to depots, greater familiarity with administration, and the possibility of drawing on national resources more directly. On the other hand, France had been at war for years. Many regions were financially strained. Horses were scarce. The state's ability to pay and requisition was not unlimited. Local populations were less willing to see their remaining resources taken, especially as enemy armies entered and local officials faced competing pressures. In this environment, Napoleon's operational style, rapid marches, concentration against dispersed enemies, again, relied on the ability to move and feed troops quickly, but the material base was thinner than it had been in the early empire. Across all these campaigns, the same themes return and deepen. Logistics was not a single system, so much as a set of interlocked systems. Administration, finance, transport, information flow, coercion over populations, and the physical geography of roads, rivers, and seasons. When one part failed, the others were forced to compensate, often in ways that accelerated the overall breakdown. The magazine system, for example, can be seen as an attempt to tame uncertainty. A depot of flour near a river crossing, guarded and inventoried, reduces dependence on a single day's requisition. But it creates a new dependency, the road between the depot and the army. That road requires wagons and escorts. Escorts require manpower. Wagons require horses. Horses require forage. Forage requires either local cooperation or coercion. Coercion generates resistance, which increases escort needs, which reduces manpower available for combat, which can force commanders to avoid battle, which prolongs the campaign, which increases consumption, which increases coercion. A system designed to stabilize supply can, under pressure, become a system that amplifies instability. Contracts likewise offered a way to mobilize resources quickly, but they required reliable payment mechanisms and enforcement. If the state could pay contractors promptly, it could often obtain better quality and more predictable deliveries. If it could not pay, it tried to pay with captured resources or with promises. That shifted risk onto contractors, who responded by charging more, reducing quality, or refusing service. Administrative oversight could counter some abuses, but oversight required time and competent personnel. War expanded faster than the pool of skilled officials. When experienced administrators were absent or ignored, the paper system detached from reality. Information flow can look abstract until it is tied to bread. A report stating that a district can deliver a certain quantity of grain is not just data. It determines whether an army chooses one road or another. If the report is wrong, the army may march into a district that cannot feed it. Then units forage farther, dispersing, and that dispersal makes it harder for staff officers to know where their troops are. Messages take longer to find them. Orders arrive late. Late orders produce uncoordinated movements. Uncoordinated movements increase the chance that a corps arrives at a stage before supplies are ready or after they are gone. The administrative errors of a morning become the tactical weaknesses of an afternoon. Even the apparently simple question of bread shows how a military state had to turn agriculture into rations on a schedule. Grain had to be collected and moved. Mills had to grind. Bakers had to bake. Ovens had to exist or be built. Fuel had to be found. Distribution had to reach companies and battalions. If bread was issued irregularly, soldiers could not plan their own behavior. They would hoard when food appeared, overeat when hungry, sell rations for alcohol, or leave ranks to seek food. Commanders could punish stragglers, but punishment could not create bread. Only the system could do that. Napoleon understood many of these mechanisms, and he often tried to manage them through operational design. He sought battles that would end campaigns quickly. He preferred theaters where rivers and roads could support movement. He frequently aimed to capture enemy magazines and capitals, which could yield both supplies and political leverage. Yet his method also assumed that speed could compensate for supply shortcomings, and that the shock of defeat would force enemies to make peace before the landscape was exhausted. As the coalition against France adapted, as wars lengthened, and as campaigns reached regions where density and infrastructure were lower, that assumption became riskier. A final point concerns the difference between feeding the army and feeding the soldier. Armies could, on paper, be supplied if depots existed and requisitions were ordered, but soldiers marched with what they could carry, and their daily reality was shaped by whether rations actually reached them, whether they had utensils, whether their shoes held, whether their units stayed together, and whether they believed that waiting in formation would bring food. Once soldiers concluded that food came only through individual action, collective discipline weakened. This was not a moral judgment, it was an operational fact. An army is a social machine powered by compliance. Supply is one of the strongest incentives for compliance. When supply fails, the machine loses power. By 1815, when Napoleon returned and attempted to reassert his rule during the 100 Days, the French army he fielded operated in a compressed time window, closer to home, and with less opportunity to build long chains of depots abroad. The campaign in Belgium and northern France again shows the link between operational tempo and supply. An army moving quickly could still obtain food locally, but it still needed organized distribution, functioning administration, and secure roads for ammunition and reserves. Even short campaigns could be undermined by small delays and uncertainties, because small delays forced armies to consume what they had carried, and consumption created immediate shortages if the next stage did not deliver. The Napoleonic era is often taught as a story of maneuver, decisive battle, and the genius of command. Those elements mattered, but the era also demonstrates a broader historical truth. Modern mass warfare is a form of administration. It is the ability to turn taxes, coercion, contracts, and transport into calories and cartridges at the right place and time. Napoleon's armies achieved remarkable feats of movement and concentration, partly because they exploited requisition, and because they operated within relatively dense European regions, where that exploitation could work for a time. Their defeats and failures, especially in prolonged, hostile, or distant theaters, show where the boundaries lay. The boundary was not a single road or a single depot. It was the total capacity of a state and an army to convert territory into sustained military power without breaking the machine that carried the power forward. And as those boundaries tightened, every decision, where to march, when to fight, how long to stay, became a logistical decision as much as a tactical one, because the army's next day depended on whether the system could still make bread appear where the columns were going next, and whether the horses that pulled the wagons would still be alive to pull them when the road turned worse. What that means, in practical terms, is that the Napoleonic Wars can be reread as repeated experiments in how far a pre-railway state could push mass armies before the mechanics of feeding them began to dictate outcomes. The French system did not operate in a vacuum. Opponents watched, copied, and adjusted. Coalition states improved their own mobilization and supply arrangements over time, and they learned to treat French lines of communication, depots, and transport as targets rather than background. Raids against magazines, pressure against river crossings, and disruption of courier routes were ways of attacking the French army without first defeating it in a set-piece battle. When the coalition coordinated multiple armies in separated theaters, the French problem was not only fighting but shifting supplies and transport capacity across space faster than opponents could force France into long, grinding campaigns. At the same time, the instruments Napoleon used to extract resources from occupied territories were themselves finite. Forced contributions could generate money and goods, but they also undermined local economies and sharpened resistance, especially when occupation became prolonged. Requisition could feed an army for a time, but repeated requisition turned a district into a depleted zone that could not sustain the next wave of troops. Even where requisition was organized through receipts and local officials, its enforcement depended on coercive power. Once coercive power was diluted by garrisons, escorts, and scattered detachments, the ability to compel deliveries weakened. The result was a feedback loop that can be seen in multiple theaters. The more insecure the countryside became, the more troops were needed to secure it. The more troops were diverted to security, the fewer remained for decisive operations. The longer the war continued, the more the countryside was exhausted. The more exhausted it became, the more foraging dispersed the troops and the more insecurity grew. In the end, the limits were physical, administrative, and financial at the same time. Physical, because roads, rivers, and seasons set hard constraints on how fast heavy supplies could move. Administrative, because requisition schedules, stage systems, inventories, and contracts only worked when there were trained personnel, reliable reporting, and enforceable authority. Financial, because armies were embedded in credit and currency systems. When payment was late or unstable, supply relationships broke down or became predatory. In a pre-industrial economy, the marginal cost of feeding additional soldiers rose quickly once local surpluses were exhausted, and the effort needed to secure that food through coercion rose even faster once populations resisted. The reason these details matter is that they clarify why Napoleon's best operational methods were also, indirectly, a response to logistical reality. A rapid campaign that forced an enemy into a decisive defeat or settlement did not only demonstrate tactical superiority, it limited the amount of time the supply machine had to function under stress. Speed reduced the cumulative toll of marching on shoes, horses, and health. It reduced the duration over which depots had to be fed and protected, and over which contractors had to deliver into uncertainty. It also increased the chance of capturing intact enemy stores, which could reset the victor's supply position overnight. As long as campaigns remained short and theaters remained relatively dense in resources and connected by usable roads and rivers, Napoleon's system could look almost effortless, even though it relied on constant administrative exertion. When wars lengthened, and especially when theaters were hostile, dispersed, or distant, the same operational approach ran into its outer boundary. At that boundary, small disruptions produced large effects. A week of heavy rain could destroy roads and immobilize wagons. A wave of horse deaths could collapse transport capacity in a way that no heroic marching could compensate for. A hostile population could make the paperwork of requisition meaningless by hiding stores and attacking detachments. A disrupted courier system could leave corps marching on assumptions that were no longer true. Once an army's daily ration became uncertain, its structure began to change from within. Straggling increased, units thinned, and the practical difference between the army's paper strength and its combat strength grew wider with every mile. Napoleon's campaigns therefore show logistics not as a separate technical domain, but as the substrate on which operational art sat. Magazines were not relics of an older system. They were shock absorbers and anchor points in a system that still depended on local extraction. Contracts were not mere side arrangements. They connected the army to markets and credit and offered speed, at the price of vulnerability to fraud and fiscal instability. Foraging was not a simple alternative to supply trains. It was a controlled practice that demanded manpower, time, and authority, and it failed when authority and time ran out. Transport bottlenecks were not occasional inconveniences. They were the constant governor on what an army could do, because every additional wagon and every additional gun brought its own demand for horses and fodder. If there is a calm conclusion that the evidence supports, it is that Napoleon's military power was never only a matter of battlefield decision. It was also the capacity to mobilize, direct, and sustain movement through a world where food was bulky, roads were fragile, animals were perishable, and administration could not instantly fix what geography and season broke. The victories help explain how a flexible core system, aggressive requisition, and the strategic use of depots could multiply French operational speed. The defeats help explain where the multiplication stopped, when distance outran control, when the countryside could no longer be converted into rations, and when the transport animals that carried the system forward died faster than the system could replace them. In that sense, the Napoleonic Wars remain a record of how an early modern state tried to run mass warfare at continental scale, and how the ordinary mechanisms of supply, when pushed past their limits, became decisive facts that no commander could wish away.